it is now a pleasure to kickstart the first, let's say, learning part of this afternoon. And I want to start explaining also to the international participants why are you hearing so much from Europeans today in this training. So, as you know, the Milan Pact is working on a regional basis, so we push a lot for processes that are happening among cities from the same region. And in Europe, we are working side by side with Eurocities, that is an association of cities. A colleague, the head of food at Eurocities will join us shortly, Madeleine Coste. And working in Europe means also working on the most, when possible, the most strategic fundings available for cities. And this was possible in the last few years thanks to the Horizon fundings that were coming from the highest level in terms of, let's say, research and development that is coming from the European Commission fundings available to develop, again, innovation, to build the ambition on several topics. There were fundings available for food systems, and food systems being, let's say, to develop actions on food systems at the urban scale. So it is very important for us to highlight that this gave the input to 5 very useful and efficient and effective projects. And one of these projects was led by Milan. It was the Food Trails project. But as you can see, it was a very interesting network and environment of cities that were involved in these fundings. So we go when we land on why are we talking about Food Trails project. So we tried to translate the vision of the Milan Pact into action. So we used these fundings available for cities and their partners to actually work on food policy development and implementation. And indeed, we had 11 cities that were fully funded by the project that worked on their food policies. So what did we do? We started, and it was, as you can see, a years-long process with several workshops. We work with researchers, and you will hear more about that in a second. But we followed all the pathway, starting in some cases from ground zero to get to having an adopted document of food policy in our cities. And this is just the visualization of this timeline. Of course, you will have all these resources available after the training, but I just want to give you really the key message of this project was to understand what are the key elements that can, let's say, trigger the change in a city, and how can we make that change not just a policy change, but also something that is meaningful for all the environment of stakeholders and actors that are present at urban level. So from the public, which of course is the public authorities of cities, but also the civil society, also the research, and also the private sector. So the project had this very ambitious goal, I would say. This is referring, let's say, more to the governance of how the food policies were approved. And as you can see, some work still has to be done. And I want to just give you a glimpse of 3 of our 11 cities that were involved. The city of Funchal is, let's say, a mid-sized city on the island of Madeira. So in the middle of the Atlantic, it is a Portuguese city and a Portuguese island. And they are very, let's say, secluded from the continent. So they are quite, they work a lot with one another. And so indeed, this showed a lot in the work that they developed. They focused on community engagement. They leveraged the hubs and the community hubs that they already had in their territory. And of course, they worked with the most deprived areas in the city, because they are kind of a closed system. They're connected, but they're still an island, very far from their fellow Portuguese citizens, let's say, that are working together with them. And they activated a very lively living lab. So let's say this environment of stakeholders, and you can see some numbers. Another city, actually local authority, because Grenoble-Alpes Métropole is indeed a French metropolitan authority. They are a city in the mountains, so completely different context, different size, because it's 500,000 people, 49 municipalities, and they focused a lot on food literacy, as well as they focus on interterritorial cooperation. So once again, the importance of collaboration. Another example is Warsaw, a capital city, 2 million people, completely different challenges. So in this case, and it is very interesting maybe to deep dive in this later in the next few days, because a representative from Warsaw will be present. They worked a lot on food waste prevention, and they achieved a thing that is often is very hard, and it is working with retailers. So how to lower food waste levels outside, let's say, the social environment. That's a very interesting result from them. So I hope that I gave you a bit the flavor of how we worked. It was a very diverse, I would say, set of solutions that were developed by cities. Because as we said, there is the policy, but then there is the action. And how can we support this action? Of course, through the support of our best minds that are, in most cases, not all the time, but most cases, coming from research bodies. And if, of course, it's coming from the knowledge exchange. And how we work on these topics, I leave the floor to Mareike from Wageningen and to Tom afterwards to explain us a bit more on this. Thank you.
Okay, I begin by the end. It ended in a practical. Okay, can I like so? Okay, okay. I begin by the end. Sharing innovation in the urban food system transitions. It ended our project in a practical guide developed to support cities to improve their food systems by learning from the experience from other cities. And the main objective of this guide is to provide practical tools and inspiration, aiming to create what Elisa said, significant and lasting change. So it emphasizes the handbook best practices that can be replicated and foster innovations and tackle multiple urban challenges through food interventions. Next slide, please. And all that information in the handbook is deriving from our 4-year unique collaboration between municipalities, citizens, and researchers in our project. And researchers, as Elisa said, played a central role in this. So they followed the cities from the start, take place in many exchanges and between cities, and could hear firsthand what is useful for cities, and that's also the audience of this handbook. So in what we did is we did peer learning activities, so learning from each other in knowledge sharing workshops between cities. We have a visit between cities with learning questions, and after that we also cascade our learnings to other cities. In next slide, you can see the orange dots are the cities, the 11 cities who are already in, and the green dots are the partner cities. So we scaled up also with a lot of cities. Next slide. The handbook is very practical. It's user friendly, as you can see here. Each chapter has its icon. You can click on it. The text is concise written, and it provides a lot of links to relevant background information. And if we go to the next slide, we see that the basis of this handbook is a quick scan lens for replication to access our city's food system. So the tool provides building blocks that can be used by cities to replicate successful initiatives. And they are helping to expand the scale and the impact of interventions or to develop similar interventions in other locations. So in next slide, you see, for example, the policy organization, the stakeholders as an example, and each block provides 3 or 4 key elements for cities looking for examples of best practice to inspire and inform innovations in their city's food system. So this, and if we see in next slide, we see one of the key examples highlighted. This is the policy organization, and it's about understanding the multi-level regulatory framework in your food policy landscape. The handbook also highlights inspiring and practical examples, if you see in next slide, and which are answering the questions that city officers might have. So the examples are divided in the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact categories, and you see them here on the slide. And for each category, we have 3 examples that are based on which the food trail cities have been working on. In next slide. For example, the question of Groningen on related to social and economic equity. In next slide, we see an example, I think, of Groningen. Can you go to the next slide, Tom? Yeah. Yeah, this is Groningen, and each example is also scored along the Food 2030 priorities, so address climate, nutrition, circularity, and community. And in doing so, it's important to mention that most food system interventions deal with multiple priority topics and categories of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact simultaneously. Of course, we have also tools in our handbook. So I hand over to my colleague, Tom, who I'm working with, to tell something more about the tools which we used.
Yeah, thank you. As researchers, we often think of tools that we use for our research, but in this case, we were thinking about creating tools that help the cities to do their work and that also help us to do research on how they do that. At the end of the project, we harvested feedback on each of these results, and these were 8 key tools that the cities reflected upon as useful for their work. And that's an important message, that with our handbook, we try to stay close to your practice as urban practitioners and follow the feedback that you've given to the researchers on tools that help you to do your work. And for example, a tool that we used was stakeholder mapping. I think we have a slide on that, which used a very simple matrix of linking your stakeholders on 2 axes, one on the power interest and another on the interest perspective. And if you use those 4 quadrants to map the stakeholders in your city on the urban food policy, it might provide you with a good strategy for thinking how to engage with these stakeholders in the urban food policy. There are stakeholders that you need to, that have a high interest in the food policy, but maybe little power on the right top, on the bottom right. those would need your support from cities to help them participate. But if they have a lot of power, but a small interest in the food policy, then you have to think about handling these stakeholders with care so that they don't undermine the policy. Other tools that we used in food trails related to monitoring the change in the food system. And here we have this ambitious exercise where we try to engage with the cities in monitoring the actions, the scale of the actions on the ground, and at the same time think through methods of harvesting the impact of those actions on the food system in the cities, or maybe even on ambitions to change that food system. And that is a duration and a lens that goes far beyond a smaller scale project. So we came with with a lot of difficult questions to the urban officials, to the civil servants, asking them about the idea behind the idea behind the action. We also help them to structure those visions, structure those assumptions on how they think that the future food system in the city can look like into a format which we call theory of change, which is nothing more than an intervention logic. It's a way that you think that in your city you can change the future. But by breaking that down into activities of today, outputs at the end of the project, outcomes that go beyond the end of the project, and impacts for the wider future, we were able to sort of make these ideas and assumptions more tangible and realistic. And some of them even became measurable indicators. And for those indicators, we all in all developed 214 indicators, which is the total collection of indicators used by the cities. And we routed them into the Milan RUAF monitoring framework. And in the end, we try to come up with this a way to structure then the discussion of how you can affect very high level goals such as climate action, nutrition, circularity, and communities, which are the four goals of the Food 2030 framework, with actions on the ground and also with assumptions on what happens in the middle between actions of today and outcomes of the far future. Then if you have impacts, if you have thoughts about what impacts you may generate with your food policy actions, you can start to think into an investor perspective. Most actions and food policy actions in cities are underfunded. There are very few financial resources available from your community, from your municipality for food policy actions, which is also one reason why Elisa underlined the importance of European research funding and the Horizon framework. But there's much more funding actually in the outside of the public arena, in philanthropies or in among impact investor communities. And a big thing that we try to use our impact logic around the impact actions was to think about whether there are fundable propositions that external funders could come in. And this is a bridge that needs to be built. It's not easy. And I can tell you that we didn't generate a single euro over the course of the project, but we were able to install some bridge building and make some connections between the urban food and these investor communities. And one part of doing that is also to look at your own city and your own food policy framework as an investment perspective. And for example, the policy brief here on the bottom, budgeting urban food policies, was a policy brief developed by the city of Milan, in which they explain how much they invest in food and what they expect to get out of that. And even such a perspective, developing that and being structural about it, can become a way for a discussion or a dialogue with investors. Marijke, do you want to take the recommendations? Actually, I could also ask you, because these are recommendations we generated from Food Trails overall. What do you think? Yeah?
So as you just heard, it was a very complex, but also very fruitful, let's say, work of trying to understand and making sense of what we do every day in our cities. Because of course, even if we do not label ourselves officially as food policy officers or responsibles or directors, we still try to keep everything together with the systemic approach of food policies. And by reflecting on this, we were able to, let's say, develop these recommendations that we work so hard also to, let's say, to make them live outside the report, because we don't really want these reports to just be on the internet and never being used again, not only because we want to exploit the European Union funds, but also because it's really a missed opportunity if this momentum that was generated among these 11 cities gets lost along the way. And as you can read through these recommendations, it is extremely important to have an internal alignment in the municipality, in the local authority administration. So to work together to avoid just working with these two colleagues that you get along with, and because the impact that you can generate also internally in terms of advocating for internal fundings, internal budget, can be immensely different if you work with other departments. Secondly, of course, having participatory approaches with your stakeholder environment, it's key. Public administrations cannot do almost anything without external stakeholders. And in these, of course, it's linked to the third recommendation, that is the one related to how you nurture relationships of trust. And you keep learning, like you never feel that you have arrived and now I know everything about food policy implementation and I don't need to learn from anybody else, especially someone that is extremely far away from my context. And of course, we go back to recommendation number 4, that is about the local government. So it is also a political issue. Food is extremely political, especially now, but it has always been. And this links to the 5th one, that is how do you develop and like how do you explore the links and you further build on the synergies that you have. Like you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can start from what's already there. But then, of course, you need to secure fundings. You can do, what we did in Food Trails and in most European projects and other kind of funded projects by grant makers is to have a very limited funding, limited in time, but of course, structural funding for food actions and food policies, it's what we try to understand for many years, and we are still trying to understand how these mechanisms can be improved and scaled, basically. And all these above are stronger as actions if are done in collaboration with researchers. We had an international network of researchers working with us, but it can be done locally. Most of the territories have researchers active, and once again, we kind of close where we opened the importance of sharing, but what can I say? You're here for a global forum on food policies, so I think you kind of got the message of the importance of sharing with everybody else. So I think we will keep working on these recommendations all together in the next few days.
Yes. I think that concludes our presentation. So there's a QR link to the this report, the handbook from Food Trails. If you can't scan it from there, please join us after the session and get your link from us here from the front. There are 2 other big reports from Food Rails that are also available through that same download link. You can see them here. But I think more generally, we're interested in your reflections and in your ideas of how this type of work, the engagement with researchers, the peer learning, the systemic reflections, how they can help you in your work. And thank you very much for your attention.